You know as a writer that you've made it when your surname gets turned into something adjectival, Orwellian, or Kafkaesque, and somehow it's the writers who are good at capturing systems, capturing bureaucracy, that are the ones that we most immortalise in this way. Of all the famous literary works about bureaucracy, maybe none's better known or more cited than Franz Kafka's The Trial. Joseph K., an ordinary man who wakes up one day to find himself accused of a crime he did not commit, a crime whose very nature is never revealed to him, and eventually finds himself in a labyrinthine network of bureaucratic traps. The book was published in 1925, and yet even today we're talking about its impact, its resonance, particularly anyone who's spent any time on hold to Centrelink. But a new contender hit the shelves last year, a new example of bureaucratic ineptitude and wizardry tied into one. It's a debut novel and it became an instant bestseller. On the surface, it's a time travel novel. Speculative fiction meets romance, meets espionage, but underneath is a sharp satirical exploration of institutional control, of what happens when government red tape meets the impossible. The book in question is called The Ministry of Time, and it's by Kaliane Bradley, centering on a civil servant who's offered a lucrative job in a mysterious new government ministry, gathering expats from across history to test whether time travel is feasible. Her role is to work as a bridge, living with, supporting and monitoring one of those expatriates, one of those time travellers. He's referred to as 1847, and his commander Graham Gore, a former Victorian polar explorer, adventurer by trade. The book follows Gore's attempts to adjust to this bizarre new world of washing machines and Spotify and feminism, following Gore and the bridge during one long sultry summer as they move from awkwardness to friendship to red-hot passion. In Kaliane's futuristic world, time travel isn't just dangerous, it's heavily surveilled and wrapped in layers of permissions, protocols, and performance reviews. I'm Michael Williams, and this is Read This, the show about the books we love and the stories behind them. Tell me about your relationship with time travel, because it seems to me that as far as a storytelling convention or a genre trope goes, it is one that is peculiarly characterised by its need for rules and structure and rigidity. And I'm interested in whether that's something that appeals to you and whether it created a challenge for you right out of the gate.
I mean, both things, really. It appealed to me because I think a lot of the stakes don't work without a certain amount of rigidity and without certain rules. I also think this is true of things like human relationships, community interaction. Like, these things depend on both agreed rules and a certain level of stakes. So that definitely appealed to me. When I first started writing, because I was more interested in the kind of after effects of having time travelled than the science of time travel. So I was being a bit vague about exactly how the rules worked. And I think it was almost 1,000 words from one of my editors in a marginal note, like, you have to explain how this works, because otherwise it doesn't matter. You can hop back in time and anything could happen, and you could, there's a timeline where everyone is just a flying monkey and everything is absolutely fine. So even though the rules really appealed to me, I was also messing around with the rules until someone poked me with a stick to make me set them up properly.
It's such a funny thing because the rules matter in an ideas sense, but they matter even more in a narrative sense. Like, as you say, you have to set up the rules so you know where the stakes are. But the other thing that you need to do, and I think all time travel literature to a certain extent has to do, is find its own limitations. How do we ring fence this off so that it doesn't become completely weightless?
Absolutely, because also I think narrative demands a certain amount of linear focus, and I think that things like character progression, narrative progression, emotional progression requires a certain amount of, as you say, ring fencing of the timeline. So if you were just throwing people around chaotically, there's nothing really for a reader to hook into. You want to be following someone, watching them bounce around. I mean, maybe Calvino would disagree with me, but certainly for a book like this.
It strikes me that when we talk about rules or structural stuff, the other way to talk about that is the language. Settling on what the kind of agreed language is for an imaginary thing goes a long way to rendering it real. How quickly did the language of the bureaucracy around time travel come to you?
I'm so embarrassed to say very fast. I would say maybe the language of bureaucracy and the language of governmental rules came faster than the big idea stuff about how time travel works and therefore what effect emotional, psychological it has on characters. I don't know, there's something dark inside me that is really drawn towards bureaucracy. This is the the John le Carré thing. I started reading John le Carré very, very young before I really understood even the political context. And when you read something like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, where he's just refusing to explain what he means by the lamplighters and the scalp hunters and circus and the cousins, didn't know what was happening until a second reread when I was much older, but still was having a great time, just a great time.
I think, and I'm glad you mentioned that because it is, and that's one of the other genre conventions that you play with in this book. But the spy novel is always great for that, if it asserts a world with a language that feels authoritative enough, you go along as a reader. It doesn't matter. It was only listening to an interview with Mick Herron I discovered that most of his terminology is completely his own fabrication.
Really?
The park is not real. They don't talk about second S. None of that's stuff that he created entirely for the world of the book, and just still lives it straight-faced enough that it feels like something true.
You've walked into a room where people are talking like this and you're like, well, I better nod along, otherwise they're going to kick me out.
I'm going to embarrass myself if I be like, oh, I didn't know they were called the dogs. They're not. That's just a convenient lie.
Oh my God, it's so good.
There is something about that that's nice, but leaving aside the human element for a moment and leaving aside the polar explorer element for a moment, the kind of overlay of time travel, bureaucracy, and the spy novel in this book, the interplay is a linguistic one. The ways in which you allow those three things to make sense and function relies entirely on that shared language and that reasoning. And maybe no more acute than the idea of the people who are out of their own time zones being talked about as expatriates.
Absolutely. So that's a very deliberate political choice on the part of the ministry to call them expatriates instead of refugees. And I do think what the ministry are very insistent on doing, one of the first things they start doing is making sure the expats are using correct language, both to describe the world around them, but also in terms of politically correct language. And I think there's two things at play for me there. One is the quite hopeful, I think, and quite positive idea that we create communities by having a shared understanding of the world we're living in and a vocabulary that we can all easily refer to. And so as a result, our sense of self is kind of built out of these words that we're given for ourselves. So there's the expat Maggie, Margaret Kemble, who's from the Great Plague of London, who is given for the first time in her life the word lesbian. And it's wonderful for her. It's really liberating and really affirming. Then there is also institutional language, which is often taking the language of radical systems, radical responses to injustice, and institutionalizing and defanging them. So it becomes about language that is correct rather than language that is empathetic. And I find there's an exciting contrast for me there, because in one case you've been given new language and new taxonomies that are really liberating, and then you're being given new languages and new taxonomies that are actually quite deadening and encourage you to think of yourself as ticking boxes rather than actually thinking about the realities of other people. And that for me is like the big tension in the ministry and the big tension for the narrator.
It is. I mean, the easy temptation is to look to Orwell for that example of the way in which an institution imposes language to deaden, but also to other. I think that relationship between those who are of the project, whether it's the colonial project, whether it's the corporate project, those who belong and those who don't, and to create an outsider status through language.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like the Orwell comparison, because the Ministry of Truth is obviously one of the reasons this book is called The Ministry of Time, is because I was thinking about that. It's never actually called The Ministry of Time in the book. It is just the title of the book. It's
That's your play it again, Sam. Everyone thinks they've heard it. It's not there.
They haven't heard it. They haven't heard it.
So how then do you build a protagonist, as you have with The Bridge, who is part of that system? How do you find the human elements of a character who chooses to speak and chooses to kind of live in a system that kind of sands off the corners of that humanity?
She was such an interesting character to develop, because when I first started writing the book, she was nobody. She was nothing. She was just a cipher. And in fact, the whole first version of the book was written in the second person. so that my friends who were reading it, it was just as if they were experiencing this funny game about living with a polar explorer from the 19th century. First of all, my agent said, "I'm begging you not to write a book in the second person. I'm not going to be able to sell that."
Your agent's a coward. I'm going to say it right now.
Chris, if you're listening, please don't fire me. But he also pointed out that, like, a love story where one half of the love story is just a nothingness, and a story about complicity where one half of that is just nothing, it's just a blank space, it's just not very satisfying. So when I started to write her, I started to think about what in her past would mean that, first of all, she's attracted to the idea of Victorian man, which is very separate to falling in love with the person Graham Gore. He is a person, he's like, he's a full human being, but attracted to the idea of this Victorian hero, this dashing Victorian explorer. And then what in her background would make her interested in, both afraid of and attracted to, the kind of control the ministry promises. And I often use the word control rather than power, because I don't think it's so much that she wants to wield power as she wants to be in control. She wants to be in control of a narrative. She wants to be in control of the way the language that about her is used, and in control of any given situation that she enters. So when I was writing her, and I was thinking about the fact that Graham Gore is entering a world where the British Empire has collapsed, and that was for him his kind of driving force. It's a background that's almost not worth acknowledging, because it would have just been over the Navy like a tea cosy. I thought maybe it would be interesting for her to be British Burmese or British Indian, someone who has family who were formerly colonised subjects and was a mixed-race white passing person, as I am, and therefore has like a complicated relationship both to how they're perceived, how they're talked about, and how they might be received by structural power. And then I thought, I'm just being really disingenuous. I'm just getting in my own way here. I'm British Cambodian. I know that's not like a former British imperial colony. It's was part of the French Empire. But it just seems like I am trying to make things difficult for myself when I know what I could write well is a British Cambodian person.
Do you think that trying to make things difficult for yourself was about eschewing a read that projected autobiographical angst or kind of personal storytelling in it? Like, were you deliberately loath to open the door to that kind of reading?
That is exactly why I was getting in my own way like that. Because, I didn't want the bridge to be, she obviously isn't me. I've never lived with a...
Well, I was going to say, the element of wish fulfillment means that as soon as the bridge is read as you at all, it's like, oh, well, this is just a personal fantasy.
This is just a personal fantasy where I get to be complicit with the British government, which I love doing, obviously. We all love doing it.
It's our secret dream. We're Australians. That's all we live for.
I was really, really resistant to that. And over the course of the editing the book, because what it was published was, I think, draft 9 of all the edits. There was putting things in about Cambodia, taking things out, working out what of my family story I wanted to draw on and what I really didn't, what should be completely fictionalized. My mother occasionally says, it didn't happen to me like this. It's like, yes, I know, it happened like this to a fictional character. This isn't you.
After the break, Kaliane shares the audience she writes for and explains why Terry Pratchett is so important to both her reading and her writing life. We'll be right back. I read another interview with you where you mentioned that one of the talkings to you got from your editor was that you needed to take the work more seriously. I want to know what that is and what that lack of seriousness was. Was it a confidence thing, or was it a defense mechanism that as long as you were playing on the page, the stakes were lower? As long as you were trying to do something serious, there was something at risk?
This is such a good question. It's something that I've been asking myself quite a lot over the course of, I'm here for the Melbourne Writers' Festival, the Sydney Writers' Festival, the Auckland Writers' Festival. I go up on stage in front of all these people who I've been seeing much bigger audiences than I've ever had in the UK. And I talk as if I shouldn't be there, or I'm slightly embarrassed to be there. And my imposter syndrome is just like coming out of my ears. And each time I do it, I think I don't know why I keep doing this. It doesn't make people like me more. It's actually very unnecessary. But I can't stop doing it at the moment, and I keep on trying to pull it back. It was the same with the book, that I was insistent, partly because it came out of such a place of joy and a kind of playfulness. And I was writing a playful thing that became serious for friends who I didn't feel would tell me that what I was doing was cringe and silly, to take this game seriously and to start thinking more seriously about what the stakes were. As soon as I started to professionalise what was that, a game just for friends, again, I had that immediate instinct like, oh, someone's going to find this a bit silly. Someone's going to think, fantasy wish fulfillment, this is really boring, this is silly, I don't need to hear what this woman wants to do with this frozen dead guy. But each time that I kind of ran across that in me, mentally, I was being received by people who were interested in the work, who were interested in how it might develop.
Well, that's why I fixate on you described the ways in which this book's origins were a shared game with friends, a kind of shared pursuit. And so those readers weren't an abstract group of readers or faceless readers. They were people you knew who presumably you were trying to delight and amuse. That's
the only thing I wanted them to hoot and holler. That was my entire intention for the first draft.
It does seem like you've unlocked something slightly important, I think, from a writerly perspective, is about the reality of that reader rather than the abstraction of that reader.
The abstraction of the reader who might receive this well or might receive this badly, rather than the friend who is going to read me in good faith and trusting me. I had an interesting conversation with Tori Peters, author of Stag Dance and Detransition Baby. I was talking about my second book, which I've handed in, and which has been quite a painful process, and which has received quite severe notes. As severe as no editor is ever going to tell their authors that they're an idiot and that nothing they've written is worthwhile, but it has had to have its publication date moved so that I can do edits. But I was saying, it's just been, I was doing, again, they're like, oh, it's terrible, I'm just a very silly person. And she said, from what I understand, you wrote the first book for friends, and now it sounds like you've been trying to write the second book to please this abstract idea of the follow-up reader for ministry. I think you need to go back and write it for friends again. And it's sort of ridiculous that it hadn't occurred to me to just think of it like that, because it's true. I think I need to go back to just thinking about the maybe 5 people who I would show it to in the first place, rather than the people who may or may not be disappointed by a second book.
Now, arguably the most scandalous thing you've done in Ministry of Time is you've written a book where you've made smoking sexy again. Like decades of people being like, no, it's not sexy, it's not cool, you shouldn't do it. And then you're like, okay, so I've got this charming Arctic explorer who is just relentlessly smoking, and it's kind of hot.
Also, I wrote it in 2021, where, we were still more or less in lockdown in the UK. And I really wanted a cigarette. It's one of those fascinating things that is both terrible and might kill you. And there's no such thing as you can't have a neutral amount of nicotine. No. You can't have a neutral amount of tar in your lungs. Also, it's great if you are at a party and, no one really smokes indoors anymore. If you just want to be like, I've got to go outside and have a cigarette. And then you don't have to talk to people for the length of a cigarette, except for other people in the smoking area who are your kindred spirits. Yeah.
I feel like we've really broken important ground on this podcast.
Absolutely.
But it does, as much as that's a very funny, very specific thing, it does get to the heart of something I really love in this book that is very deliberate, which is thinking about different social mores in different times and the ways in which they land so differently. It's one thing to think of an idealized Victorian hero who's a particular kind of stoic and kind of soulful and all these things at once. But then to think about the politics of the day and the way they probably played out and the assumptions and the, baseline chauvinism and racism and unthinking bigotry that is bolted on. How important was it to you that you weren't actively ahistorical? It
was so important. It's actually quite funny to remember how important it was to me and how deranged I became, desperately trying to imagine what it would have been like for Graham Gore specifically, but to a lesser extent also the other characters, how it would have been like to experience the 21st century. I was really taking this experiment very seriously, taking this game very seriously. I was doing things like reading this enormous book about the Victorian home because I wanted to just imagine what the curtains would have looked like, what the flooring would have looked like, and just how a house would have felt different to a man walking out of Victorian England into 21st century London, just how his body would have reacted differently to the weight of the clothes. Clothes used to be much heavier and much denser. It was colder, and they didn't have kind of modern innovations with textiles. But also things like being interested in British polar exploration, as I am, does eventually mean you have to admit to yourself that what you're interested in is an imperial project. There is no good reason for those men to have been in the Arctic or Antarctic. There's no good reason for them to have landed in the Inuit homelands and died there in droves, just like for stupid reasons that were never useful, in fact, for the empire, because the Northwest Passage was not traversable, was just a racist project. When you are confronted with that, I think you can either say, well, I'm different. I'm different and my interest is actually really good. Or you can be willing to interrogate why you might be interested and where the friction lies. I spent a lot of time thinking about how I would be received by these people who I was studying with deep fascination and thinking of as fully rounded humans who had different responses to being in the Arctic, for whom their deaths were tragic. They were completely preventable. They shouldn't have been up there, but it was tragic. It's tragic when someone dies in awful circumstances. Nevertheless, the idea of a Victorian man being presented with a mixed-race woman who has a job, he still would have done some real spicy microaggressions at me, you know. Of course, the narrator of the bridge also gets it wrong because she's so institutionalized. And again, her ideas are more about being correct than being empathetic. And so she's teaching him stuff that isn't quite right. And he's like, I don't really understand because what you're saying seems to contradict the world we're actually in. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. I just don't think it would have been interesting to me to have Graham Gore as, turning up and being like, I actually have always thought feminism was brilliant.
Yeah.
In my heart, it's always been the case.
But also, as far as romance genre tropes go, you actually need that person with whom you disagree or you have a fundamentally different worldview. Part of the friction of that kind of mounting desire comes precisely from the ways in which he is alien.
Absolutely. And I think this is the thing about romance, right? There has to be a reason, but they don't immediately make out. Now that we're in a world where it is possible to just swipe right on someone, meet them, immediately like them. That's it. There was no friction, there was no tension, there was no difficulty. To sustain a romance novel, there does have to be that. There has to be something in the way of them.
You've worked in publishing for years. There is clearly an intimate relationship between your reading and your writing. Tell me why Terry Pratchett is such an important writer to you.
Wow, where do I begin? So I first started reading Pratchett entirely by accident when I was 9 or 10, because I picked up a copy of Interesting Times, actually, which is, for anyone who isn't familiar with the Discworld series and Terry Pratchett, is quite late on in the Discworld series, talks about characters who have already been established very much earlier on in the series, and is the kind of in the middle of a storyline kind of book. But I was very attracted to the bright colours and of the cover. I started reading it. I didn't really understand what was going on, but he's so funny. He doesn't patronise a reader, he doesn't talk down to them, but he does expect you to keep up. He expects you to be in on the joke. He'll make the joke and he expects you to be in on it. And that's such a deliciously welcoming thing, especially when you're a 10-year-old girl, I do remember one time I met him to get The Truth, his 25th Discworld novel, signed. And he just knew exactly how, like, a slightly kooky, I think I would have been 12 by then, 12, 13, how a slightly kooky teenager wanted to be spoken to. He was just a very, empathetic man. The thing I like about the Discworld series is both that they are, just very funny. He was very, very funny. He used humour he could play a humorous joke like a trumpet, and he could use it to make a very serious point. I liked that they were funny. I liked that they were also very serious, which is not to say that they were not funny in places, but rather that he took his characters seriously. He took his characters seriously and their realities and the responses that they would be engendering in a reader. And I think he took his readers very seriously as well, actually. What, as a writer, do you hope you've taken from him, given that he was such a formative writer for you? Partly that a sense of joy is going to compel both the reader but also the writer. I really think he enjoyed writing his books. I really hope so. That joy is a perfectly valid and perfectly brilliant way to be launched into a story. And also that funniness can be serious, that humour can be serious, and that it isn't lesser, and you don't have to apologise for being a humorous writer. You can, in fact, have something serious to say and still be very funny.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think for me, the other thing, to come back to the structure of time travel or whatever, is he was very good at having set up an entire world with its own internal logic, its own traditions, and presenting them in a way that was matter of fact. If he wasn't interested in an element, he wouldn't over-explain it, but he would set up the rules, have them be there as the underlying reality. There's no imposter syndrome in a Pratchett book.
No, absolutely not. He knows what he's doing, and he knows that you feel like you're in safe hands with the Pratchett book. Actually, this is something I think about with magic, the way he dealt with magic, which feels like a really pragmatic and thoughtful series of limitations, because quite often he says that there used to be raw magic when sorcerers existed and anyone could do anything, just throwing fireballs across the world. In fact, now in what is contemporary Discworld, magic is very limited. There's a limit that you can do with it because it is a depleting resource. And there is like a very clear parallel to the way we use technology and the way we think of technology with the way he treats magic. It has, unfortunately, slightly changed the way I read other books with magic in, because every time I see someone who's just a wizard doing magic, I'm like, where is that energy coming from? Like, what's going on? What are the rules with magic in your universe? Explain it to me.
I like your inner bureaucrats just swinging into action. Pulled out a pen and a pad and you're like, well, this won't do.
Sorry, we have to tax this and there are tariffs on this one, sorry.
You are misbehaving and we are going to write you up. It's the only way. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Kaliane Bradley's best-selling novel, The Ministry of Time, is available everywhere now. Before we go, a couple of time travel shout-outs that I wanted to give as a big fan of the time travel genre. The Time Traveller's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger. If you haven't read it, it is well worth reading. Don't see the stupid film with Eric Bana and Rachel McAdams. The book is romantic and sad and divine. And also a mention to Kate Atkinson's Life After Life. It's a kind of literary Groundhog Day, but its tricksiness with timelines and time travel are very good. And then Terry Pratchett, rated a mention in this. He's very good at time travel too. So there are 3 time travel recommendations if you don't want to watch Back to the Future again. Also, before we get out of here, if you haven't heard the news, Michelle de Kretzer was awarded the 2025 Stellar Prize for her fantastic theory and practice. We were lucky enough to have her on Read This earlier in the year, so if you haven't given it a listen yet, go back to the archive. And while you're there, rate, review, share, listen again, all of the things put Read This into other people's ear holes. That's it for this week's show. You can find all the books we mentioned at your favourite independent bookstore. Read This is a Schwartz Media production made possible with the generous support of the ARA Group. The show is produced and edited by Clara Ames, with mixing by Travis Evans and original compositions by Zoltan Fetcher. Posey McCackey edits our transcripts. Thanks for listening. See you next week.